Now, the World Meteorological Organization's latest State of the Climate report is a dismal litany of humanity's failure to tackle climate disruption. So says the United Nations Secretary General at the launch of the 2021 report that points to new records being set in greenhouse gas concentrations, sea level rises, ocean heat and ocean acidification. Now, these indicators point to human activities causing planetary-scale changes with harmful and long-lasting ramifications for sustainable development and ecosystems. The report says that extreme weather has led to hundreds of billions of dollars in economic losses, often with a heavy toll on human lives and well-being.
The images after extreme rainfall in South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal province that claimed more than 430 lives, causing billions of rands in damage, still fresh. And while no one event can definitively be blamed on climate change, the mounting evidence globally is pointing in one direction.
I will give you the bottom line. The global energy system is broken and bringing us ever closer to climate catastrophe. Fossil fuels are a dead end, environmentally and economically. The war in Ukraine and its immediate effects on energy prices is yet another wake-up call. The only sustainable future is a renewable one. We must end fossil fuel pollution and accelerate the renewable energy transition before we incinerate our only home. Time is running out.
He called for 5 critical actions, starting with renewable energy technologies that must be treated as essential global public goods, calling for a global coalition on battery storage to fast-track innovation and deployment, to secure, scale up and diversify the supply of critical components and raw materials for renewable energy technologies, for governments to build frameworks and reform bureaucracies to a level playing field for renewables. He urged governments to shift subsidies away from fossil fuels while calling for private and public investments in renewable energy to triple to at least $4 trillion annually.
In many countries, these systems still favor deadly fossil fuels. We must prevent bottlenecks where gigawatts of renewable projects are held up by red tape, permits and grid connections. I call on governments to fast-track and streamline approvals of solar and wind projects, modernize grids and set ambitious 1.5-degree aligned renewable energy targets that provide certainty to investors, developers, consumers and producers. Renewable energy policies are fundamental to reduce market risk and drive investment into the sector.
Guterres says coal, oil and gas receive roughly $11 million in subsidies every minute of every day, highlighting how governments around the world pour $500 billion annually into artificially lowering the price of fossil fuels, more than triple what renewables receive.
For solar and wind power, upfront payments account for 80% of lifetime costs. That means big investments now will reap big rewards for years to come. But some developing countries pay 7 times more in financing costs than developed countries. We need blended finance that provides the necessary structures to close existing funding gaps and unlock the trillions held by private sector. This means adjusted risk frameworks and more flexibility to scale up renewable finance.
The WMO report also confirmed that the past 7 years have been the warmest 7 years on record, with droughts in the Horn of Africa, severe flooding in southern Africa, and extreme heat in India and Pakistan as we enter the hurricane season in North America. A mere snapshot of today's reality. And as the UN chief stressed, the time to jumpstart the renewable energy transition is now, before it's too late. Sherman Briceby's SABC News, New York.
Well, for more on this report, we're now joined by Dr. Omar Baddour, who's the head of the World Meteorological Organization on climate monitoring and the coordinator of this report. Dr. Baddour, thank you so much indeed for joining us. And just reading the headlines of this, it's quite alarming what you found in your report.
Thank you for inviting me, and good evening. The report of 2021 is the latest series of the annual report that WMO has been publishing for more than 30 years. And also it comes right after the IPCC sixth assessment report. The headline information in this report include the key messages about 4 climate indicators which have been broken records. Those include mainly the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, which is the main driver of climate change. And also what happened most is in the ocean. The ocean has been affected by warming more rapidly than before. Actually, the heat that is emitted by the global warming, 90% of it is absorbed by the ocean. In addition to that, the ocean plays as a buffer for CO2 because it absorbs about 20 to 30% of CO2 emitted by anthropogenic activity. This is good for the planet, but on the other hand, it enhances the acidity of the ocean and affects the biological life in the ocean. Therefore, these two factors, the warming of the ocean and the acidification, is a major threat for the ecosystems, marine ecosystems. And in addition to that, the ocean also is increasing in sea level rise. This is associated with the warming, but also with the melt of the ice sheets and the glaciers, which discharge the melted ice into the ocean, which expands further the level of the ocean.
All right. How much of this do we know for certain is due to human activity? How much of it is nature over time?
This is clearly associated with climate change, which is due to the anthropogenic activity of humankind. This has been already demonstrated in the 5th assessment report 6 years ago, where it says these changes are unequivocal and they are without doubt associated with the human activities. So there is no doubt that this is linked to climate change. And also the extreme events that are also driven by the change in the global climate system are also being attributed directly or indirectly to the emission, CO2 emission in the atmosphere, especially when it comes to heat waves. We know for sure now that heat waves are increasing in frequency and intensity, and they are causing excess of death in different parts of the world. Recently, you might have already heard about the prolonged heat wave in Pakistan and India, reaching some level of temperature very high for human to adapt to. So all in all, there is no doubt that climate change now is unequivocal, and also it affects the whole climate system as well as local climate through extreme events.
So the goal is to make sure that we don't get to above 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial levels. How close are we to that? And if we carry on at this rate, how soon might that happen?
Unfortunately, we are not far. The temperature today is close to 1.2. And we are not far from 1.5. So if we go with the same rate of emission that is already recorded in 2021, we for sure be expecting that reaching 1.5 will not wait for more than a decade. In this sense, it's very important that we do all we can to really reduce emission the minimum, so that the balance between the emission and absorption by the natural system is equilibrated. and that will stabilize CO2 in the atmosphere and therefore stabilize temperature as well. So there is still hope to achieve this goal of 1.5 or at least 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, but this needs to have a carbon neutral planet by 2050. This is a target that the scientists have already demonstrated, so we don't have too much time to waste to achieve this objective.
Climate change knows no boundaries, but it does seem that some regions are a little bit more vulnerable to the extreme effects. Is Africa on that map where we are more vulnerable, perhaps?
Yes, for many reasons. First one is exposure. Africa is exposed to various types of high impact events, including especially drought of Africa, which has become very frequent, but also in the southern part of the continent. We just recorded the past few years very strong and intensive and long-lasting drought in Southern Africa, in Southern Africa part of the continent. And this year, in 2021, Madagascar suffered 2 years of drought with a huge impact on agriculture and food security. In addition to the drought, we also record floods. In Sudan, for instance, recorded in the past 2 years very intense floods, which inundated a large part of the cities in Sudan and also in South Sudan. Addition to that, the sea level rise is affecting large part of West Africa and also in East Africa, and this is associated with degradation of coastal region and also the degradation of ecosystems. So Africa, from this point of view, is very exposed to extreme events and also to climate change. In addition to that, the capacity to adapt is still very low in African continent due to reduce the resilience capacity. And unfortunately, this needs efforts and needs funds and needs resources to make to heighten this resilience so that climate change affects less as currently. But having said that, this does not mean that only the African continent is vulnerable to climate change, but also many parts of the rest of the world, including developed countries, because now extreme events, unfortunately, there is no magic tool to combat extreme floods, for instance. In Germany in 2021, floods were associated with hundreds of casualties and also were associated with more than $20 billion equivalent losses. In the United States, as you can imagine, every hurricane or every tropical cyclone that hit southern part of United States usually is associated with tens of billions of US dollar damages, and in many cases also people die because of these tropical cyclones. So the world is not safe from climate change. Whether it's developed or developing countries, we are all on the same boat in terms of being affected with extreme events.
We keep hearing messages that, we must do something before it's too late. How close are we to that point where actually we won't be able to do anything anymore?
I think the message is we are already past some threshold that we can't do anything to reverse a course. For instance, the heat that is accumulated in the ocean is there for centuries or even millennia, and the dioxide carbon that we emit in the atmosphere will stay there for millennia. So it's too late to do anything for that. The message is to minimize the climate change effects in the next decades. This means that achieving 1.5 is still, close to 1.5 is still causing problems. But if we exceed 1.5, problems will be worse. And reaching 2.20 or more than 2 is then we are getting to a planet that it's difficult to live in. So the message is save as much as we can, but not wait more than a decade to do that. We have 1 decade, and that this decade should end with drastic measures in terms of mitigation, in terms of economic transition from fossil-based economy to green economy, and also transformation of societies in terms of consumptions and behaviors. So it's many facets, but everyone is responsible, including the policymakers, including the citizens, the civil societies. All together, we are responsible to make every effort we can that will help to stabilize temperature around 1.5.
Dr. Baddour, thank you very much indeed for joining us and sharing with us the highlights of this alarming report. But let's hope that we take heed and take action urgently. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.